To the fourth lecture of the National Conference. Today we have Dr. John Thomas with us. The moderator for today is Jelena. She's a PhD scholar of the department. She's working on colonialism, hegemony, and the individual, print culture in 19th century Travancore. Over to you, Jelena, for today's proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, Shiva ma'am. A very good evening and warm welcome to the fourth session of 7-day online national conference conducted by Department of History at Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit Kaladi in honor of Dr.A. Paslithil and Dr. M.T. Narayanan on their retirement. The running theme of this webinar, as mentioned, is Critique and Constructions, Contemporary Writings on the Histories of Keralam. This webinar series intends to include speakers from a relatively new generation of historians and social scientists working on the history of Kerala. Today, we are honored to have with us Dr. John Thomas for the keynote address. Before we move on, a set of general instructions for all the participants. Kindly mute your audio and keep your video turned off throughout the session. If you have any queries or questions related to this lecture, kindly type them into the chat box and I will be reading it out to the speaker on your behalf after your lecture. Attendance will be recorded automatically on this Google Meet platform for those registered participants who are joining us through the live streaming on YouTube. Attendance sheet will be provided in the YouTube chat box towards the end of the lecture. Moving on, to formally introduce the speaker and to welcome the gathering, we have with us Radhika, a PG student in the department. Over to you, Radhika.
On behalf of the Department of History, Sri Shankaracharya University, we are delighted to welcome all of you to the working paper presentation series, which is starting today, Dr. John Thomas talk. Speaking in Beyond Adulations and Aspirations, Historicizing Missionaries and their Work. Dr. John Thomas is an Assistant Professor of History in the Department of Humanities and Social Science, IIT Guwahati. For his MPhil degree, he explored the relationship between caste, aggressive slavery, and the shifting perspectives of missionaries on labor in the 19th century Central Travancore. A work that he has recently returned to with an added interest in tracing the intellectual biography of a local missionary in Central Travancore. Having received his doctorate from Jawaharlal Nehru University, he has broadly worked on the role of religion in mediating the formation of cultural and political identities in South Asia. His doctoral thesis examined the role played by the missionaries, the local church, and the colonial and colonial past colonial states in promoting and sustaining a particular understanding of Christianity and how that came to have an impact on the formation and character of Naga nationalism in India's northeast. This work was recently published into a book under the title Evangelizing the Nation, Religion and the Formation of Naga Political Identity. We are extremely honored to have you, sir, today with us. I extend a warm welcome to you. Also welcome all the participants to the talk. Thank you.
Thank you. So at the outset, I would like to thank Dr. Shiba for inviting me to this conference. I would also like to give my best wishes to Dr. Paslithil and Dr. Narayanan, in whose honor this conference is being held. And I'm really happy to be speaking to an audience in Kaladi, primarily because also a lot of my old students are there, and it's really good to be able to speak to you. Generally, a lot of my work has been on the northeast of India. As a result, it's very rarely that I have spoken to an audience in Kerala. And as I've returned back to working on Kerala, whatever I say and whatever arguments I make, all your feedback and comments will be most welcome. So let me begin. In much of the discussion around Kerala's encounter with modernity, the oft-used category, missionaries, and the work that they engaged in, especially during the colonial period, are more often assumed or taken for granted rather than analyzed, interpreted, or empirically explained. The character and meaning attributed to missionaries and their work remain more or less essentialized, fixed, and frozen across time and space. Almost as if who they were and what they have done is already known and no further examination or explanation is required. They are predetermined and given. So, for example, the moment we talk of missionaries and their work, at the back of our mind, it is already assumed that missionaries are always Caucasian in race, that they are European or American, that they are mostly men and races, that in terms of their work, they're always involved in quote-unquote civilizing mission. These are some of the common assumptions that we have, which we take for granted and tend to apply across time and space. We have neither thought about the extent to which such taken for granted assumptions may or may not be useful for understanding a particular historical moment, nor have we examined how such assumptions tend to become normative and taken for truth. The assumptions we hold may or may not be true, but then to what extent? Has it been observed? Is it verifiable? Is it rooted in a certain empirical reality? The process of assumption making becomes further complicated because of the contemporaneity and frequent overlaps of the Christian missionary enterprise with the colonial process, especially in the modern times. Given the colonial discursive field where the pendulum moves back and forth between binaries such as colonial, anti-colonial, or religious, secular, and given the fact that missionaries and their work tend to get implicated in the colonial process in varying degrees, what is assumed about them becomes highly polarized. Either they come to be spoken of in adulatory terms, romanticized, or in aspersive terms, condemned. This process of strongly qualifying missionaries and their work further blinds us from observing them, interpreting them, and understanding them more clearly. Now, in the first part of this lecture, what I would like to do is to talk about how this has figured over the years in the historiographical landscape that we are familiar with in India. For a very long time, the dominant set of histories written on Christian missionaries and their work were hagiographic. They were written primarily within the purview of ecclesiastical institutions such as missionary societies, churches, etc. They insisted on portraying missionaries and their work as untainted, without any blemish or fault. Even if there was, it was cited as a rare instance of having fallen from grace. These histories, on the one hand, celebrated the heroism, generally of the white male missionaries, in overcoming adversities, in bringing gospel to the quote-unquote heathen to save them from their moral turpitude. On the other, these histories also muted the role of numerous local converts and mission workers and various local and foreign women who were also part of the mission institutions. Histories written in this vein, in general, held a favorable attitude towards colonial political dispensation. They not only considered colonial rule as being providential, but took for granted the superiority of Western civilization, and therein easily glossed over the ethnocentrism and racial politics that was characteristic of missionary work in the non-Western world. These adulatory historical narratives, though came to be contested in various quarters, subsequently often went on to become the template for the official historical renderings of churches and other institutions that came out of the missionary movement. In the wake of anti-colonial nationalism, these hagiographical histories came to be aggressively countered, sort of turned on its head by a range of nationalist histories. Not so much for their socially exclusive and celebratory template, but for their links with the colonial project. These histories amplified the alleged, quote-unquote, conspiratorial role of missionaries and their collusion with British administrators in exercising colonial control. They dismissed missionaries as colonial agents and their work as a threat to national culture, which was generally assumed to be upper caste and Hindu. Now, writing about 19th century Travancore, Sardar K.M. Panikkar, the well-known statesman and diplomat, alleged that missionaries were just the handmaiden of the British government to, within quotes, seduce a number of young Hindus of good families into the fold of Christianity. In post-independence India, they were alleged to be a threat to the political integrity of the nation state. The Niyogi Commission report, tabled in 1956, detailed the dangers of missionary work for the political integrity of the new nation state. Informed by the cultural and political anxieties of a nascent nation state, these nationalist histories generally became mere retorts or reactions, a process of casting aspersions on all that was celebrated in hagiographical histories and crowning them as colonial. The subaltern studies, especially following its post-colonial turn, did offer a critique of the statist preoccupations of nationalist histories. However, as its primary focus was on how subaltern subjects were being constituted into modern identities through various colonial practices, unfortunately, it did not show much interest in unpacking the predetermined assumptions and examine the complexities of the category missionaries and the various nuances of their lives, attitudes, and work. Rather, it lazily portrayed them as one among the many mediators of colonial power. The repercussions of this was that an under-analyzed and unexplained notion of who missionaries are and what they do in particular contexts became the basis for discussions on the subaltern encounter with missionaries. Moreover, the existing hagiographical and nationalist assumptions attributed to them remained intact, producing an increasingly polarized and politically charged field of discussion, leaving us once again without any clear understanding of who the missionaries were and what did they exactly do. To begin with, it would be highly tenuous to take missionaries and their work as a monolith. There were multiple fissures or fractures among missionaries on the lines of race, gender, caste, age, denomination, nationality, personality, etc. These fissures, mediated by power, informed the attitudes, interactions, and engagements within the missions, leading to differences, debates, and censures as much as unity in purpose and action. And the encounter of the missionaries with people and institutions outside the mission. This has been highlighted by various historians, including Geoffrey Cox in his work on Punjab, Eliza Kent in her work on gender and Christianity among Tamil Christians, and Susan Wellington Arper in her biographical work on V.S. Azariah. And there are several others. To illustrate this further, let me provide a couple of vignettes from the little work I have done on the CM missionaries in central Travancore. In the 1850s and 60s, the CMS missionaries became actively involved in mission work among the slave castes and the abolitionist campaign against agrestic slavery. Going by their age and entry into mission work in Travancore, it is obvious that the missionaries who were the most involved in the abolitionist campaign and enthusiastic about mission work among the slave castes were the younger missionaries. While some of the older missionaries like Henry Baker Sr. and Joseph Peat supported the abolitionist campaign, they were also a bit wary of the enthusiasm of the younger missionaries. Several words of caution were served to them. And following the Royal Proclamation of 1855 abolishing slavery, when the younger abolitionists became involved in cases to protect the rights of slave and lower caste converts, the older missionaries were all the more of the opinion that the missionary has no special cross to bear on behalf of the agrestic slaves. This tension and anxiety over the actions of the younger missionaries existed not only in Travancore, but was also evident in other parts of the subcontinent where missionaries, much to the discontent of the British administration, became involved in campaigns against untouchability, forced labor, and other exploitative practices. The involvement of James Long against the exploitative labor practices in the indigo plantations in Bengal, and his subsequent imprisonment being an example. The debate and differences among the missionaries on issues that were deemed political became all the more a concern for the board of directors of the CMS following the 1857 revolt. And they had even brought out an order castigating, warning, and censuring the young missionaries. Among the young missionaries in central Travancore, not the young missionaries, sorry. Among the missionaries in central Travancore, Joseph Peat, besides being of foul temper and prone to being overtly racist at times, was someone who, with his belligerent attitude, held sway over the decisions of the mission in relation to local or quote-unquote native missionaries and evangelists. When George Martin, one of the local CMS missionaries, was assigned independent charge of a mission institution, there was strong dissent on the part of Joseph Peat. He not only raked up allegations against Martin, but also wrote in detail about how unfit a native missionary would be to hold independent charges. In spite of Martin's impeccable social and literary contributions and experience of missionary service, he was constantly looked at with much suspicion and jealousy by some of the European missionaries. One of the possible factors, besides his waning health, that led Martin to become far more recluse in the 1860s towards the end of his life. While Martin had been distanced by the Syrian Christian community from which he hailed for his work among agrestic slaves, a few younger British missionaries shared close friendship with him and supported him. The most prominent of them being Richard Collins and his wife Frances Collins. Richard Collins was even critical of how European dominance in the secular political world was being mapped on to the administration of the mission, and pleaded not to cramp native agency, but to provide them with the autonomy and encouragement to develop and blossom themselves. Both these vignettes, in a small way, one can cite various instances of this, but to show the complexity of the missionary, the complexities of the differences among the missionaries and the fractures among missionaries. However, both these vignettes, in a small way, not only reveal the fissures, the differences and tensions among missionaries that happened on multiple lines, but also the inconsistency or unpredictability of personalities, situations, and relationships. There is no one prototype that is applicable. There were personalities who were overtly racist and intolerant, as well as those who were far more self-reflexive of their subject position and willing to be accommodative. There were moments and relationships of hostility as well as friendships, making it rather difficult to paint everyone and everything with the same brush. To a large extent, at a more general level, what this points towards is also the unpredictability of life and life situations itself, and how sincerely and painstakingly we need to paint a cogent portrait of it. If the category missionaries was wrought with multiple fissures and fractures within, the relations between missionaries and the colonial state, between missionaries and the local people, institutions, and knowledge, was also one that was tinged with much ambiguity and uncertainty, and most importantly, contingent on the specific historical context in which such relations transpired. When we look at the relations between missionaries and the colonial state, while it is true that Euro-American missionaries in general looked up to British rule as providential for the moral and spiritual upliftment of India, the relationship between British administrations and the missionaries on the ground was fraught with much uncertainty and was to a large extent contingent on the specific context. One of the books that illustrates this in the context of Travancore, which I also feel has not got much attention, is Koji Kawashima's Missionaries and the Hindu State, Travancore 1858 to 1936. He argues that there was never a given or a fixed kind of relationship between missionaries, Travancore State, and the government of Madras. Rather, it was constantly changing according to how it suited each of their interests and ambitions. The Travancore state, while wanting to maintain its legitimacy as a Hindu state, also wanted to modernize itself to be a model state, for which the assistance of the missionaries was crucial. Meanwhile, the British were often wary of and eventually indifferent to the missionaries, since the latter's interventions in the religious and social life of Travancore was bound to generate much social and political discontent. It was also the case that the Travancore state eventually depended on the missionaries to ensure that social order was maintained as a result of mass conversions among lower and untouchable castes. In addition, I would also argue that the personalities at the helm of affairs also mattered. Among the divans and residents, there were those who were sympathetic to the missionaries as well as those who were indifferent and hostile. There were missionaries who were accommodative and open to negotiating with the Travancore state, and there were those who preferred to bypass the Travancore state and address their grievances directly to the British administration. By the 20th century, there were several missionaries who no longer found the British rule to be providential, and preferred to keep themselves aloof from the British administration. In the wake of the national movement and the world ecumenical movement, many missionaries had even begun to enter into a dialogue with national leaders and sympathize with India's right to self-rule. During the First and Second World Wars, the relations between non-British missionaries and the British administration had also worsened, with missionaries being brought under greater surveillance of the state. Moving on to the encounter between missionaries and local people, this was also anything but straightforward and linear. In other words, there were hardly instances where power came to be arbitrarily exercised by the colonial outsider on the local populace, who are assumed to be passive subjects bereft of any agency. Even if the missionary had his own presuppositions and prejudices and was engaged in a mission where he wanted to demonstrate and assert his superiority in morals, civilization, and knowledge, the local people were not in any way docile and passive, but active agents choosing to either enter or not enter into a conversation or a dialogue with the missionary. The journal entries of missionaries are as much replete with instances where people they encounter refused to engage with them and hence felt helpless, as instances where people entered into a dialogue with them and in the process took what is meaningful for them, situated in their particular subject position. Blinded by a sense of superiority and cultural arrogance, the encounter between missionaries and the local people at times became a one-way conversation. But this was not always the case. There were instances where the encounter between missionaries and the local people led also to some level of fruitful dialogue, sometimes leading to the one spoken to as well as the missionary making changes to their earlier presuppositions and perspectives. Will Sweetman, in his work on Bartholomew Ziegenbalg, illustrates how when Ziegenbalg set sail to the East Indies, he was unprepared and did not know what to expect, but was driven by a zeal to convert a people he defined as barbaric. However, his subsequent engagement with Tamil literature, scholarship, and people compelled him gradually over a period of time to rectify his own presuppositions and prejudices and regard the local people as extremely intelligent and rational people who led a quiet, honorable, and virtuous life. And the local culture he engaged with much sensitivity. The character of knowledge produced via the encounter between missionaries and the local people was also not straightforward or obvious enough to be categorized or boxed as colonial. It was multi-layered, contingent on local conditions and on global circulation of knowledge, experimental in character, and produced through close interactions with local actors and institutions. Nicholas Tode Jensen, a Danish scholar, writing on the Danish Halle missionaries in Tranquebar, indicates that in the field of medicine and botany, rather than a simple and mechanical transfer and use of scientific knowledge from Europe, the missionaries were involved in the production of a new scientific understanding based on their engagement with local systems of knowledge and environment. They entered into dialogue with multiple local actors, participated in global intellectual exchanges, constantly revised their findings and modes of inquiry, given the personal and practical problems they confronted in the situations where they resided, and produced a knowledge that was neither clearly Western nor indigenous, but one that was hybrid, for want of a better term. Similarly, Indira Viswanathan Peterson, in her work on Raja of Tanjore, Sarfoji II, talks about the series of dialogues and intellectual exchanges between him and the German missionary C.S. John. Both were committed to Enlightenment reasoning and experimenting with modern public education. There were differences between them. While the latter subscribed to the idea that diffusion of European knowledge is important for material progress, the former preferred a more qualified application of European knowledge for the modernization of his state. Yet, they had tremendous respect for each other and a willingness to learn from each other. We also see similar kinds of exchanges and production of knowledge in the context of Travancore. Here again, I come back to George Martin. His essays on what ought to constitute children's education and modern healthcare is important in this respect. As a local missionary, his greater access to local people and the intellectual exchanges that happen between them is also most insightful. In all these discussions, the point that one keeps returning to is this: missionaries neither lived nor worked in a vacuum, outside of space and time. From the time they entered the mission service in a particular locale, till the time they left the service, either naturally or otherwise, they were involved in a process of responding to and growing with the contingencies and circumstances they encountered. They were people who interacted with local people and institutions at an everyday basis, evolving over a period of time and producing new repositories of knowledge and ways of being. Certainly, power was implicated in this process. It would be naive to assume it was not. However, it is worth reminding ourselves that there were multiple centers of power, situated within and between groups and institutions vying for recognition and dominance. Now, I'm just entering into a bit about the archive itself. A clearer observation and understanding of missionaries and the work they did would become possible only if we go beyond a selective and instrumentalist reading of the missionary archive and recognize the varied genre it encompasses, the varied voices that emanate from it, and the varied silences it enforces. Before I conclude, I would like to delve on this a bit. The missionary archive is a repository of multiple voices and expressions. There are multiple genres, and this includes annual reports, memoirs, histories, registers, journals of different kinds, magazines, textbooks, novels, and other prose, etc. At one level, it could be said that it is the voice of the officialdom that permeates the organization of the archive, as well as what generally becomes available in the archive. It is what sets the tone and tenor of the published material in the archives, which are often the first set of materials that a researcher is tempted to consult. For instance, there are annual reports. These are published on the occasion of annual General Committee meeting of the missionary societies. Besides the detailed minutes and proceedings of the General Committee meeting and reports of various departments, interestingly, they contain short excerpts from the individual reports, journals, and letters that individual missionaries in the field wrote and sent to their superiors in Europe or America. However, these excerpts were carefully chosen to ensure that the individual inclinations of individual missionaries would not creep into the officially sanctioned narrative. This becomes all the more evident when one consults the unpublished collections and finds clear indication of how certain portions of from the letters and reports of individual missionaries were struck out. In spite of the official character of these annual reports, the official voice of the editorial board, however, can be treated as the sole voice structuring the narrative. After all, even if the reports were tailor-made for official consumption, it was based on the kind of information that individual missionaries in specific mission stations wished to divulge. The individual missionaries knew that the letters, reports, and journals they wrote were going to be used in the preparation of the report, that could also become the subject of discussion and debate within committees and councils. Hence, they would have decided what should be the content and the narrative strategy involved in what they wrote for official consumption, thereby making other voices, often situated close to the field, available and structuring the way the report was prepared. It is an analysis of all these multiple voices that will sometimes bring the nuances and complexities of missionary articulation to a historian's attention, as well as lay bare the fault lines of missionary enterprise. Even if we are not able to discern voices other than the official one, the missionary archives also includes genre that were found to be not serious enough by Euro-American male missionaries. While texts such as missionary reports, histories, biographies, and memoirs with their grand narratives detailing the progress of missionary enterprise and the heroic acts of individual missionaries in heathen lands predominantly remain the domain of Euro-American male missionaries, there were genres like novels, short stories, and other prose, which often became the domain of local missionaries and women missionaries. For instance, if we take novels and short stories, as far as the missionary establishment was concerned, novels and short stories with their promises of being fictional were assumed to be acceptable and legitimate genre for women and local missionaries to employ. At the same time, deprived of any significant role in the framing of most other missionary literature, women and local missionaries used the opportunity, found novels and short stories ideal genre for writing about the characters and institutions they encountered in real life. Concealed under the garb of fiction, both these genres provided ample opportunity to talk the reality they encountered, even if it meant, at times, straying away from the lines scripted for them by the missionary societies. The missionary archive, therefore, is a mine of endless possibilities, despite the limitations there are. They complicate the taken for granted and monolithic assumptions about missionaries and their work, and introduce us to multiple personalities, initiatives, and histories that are not amenable to being pigeonholed into any predetermined categories and labels. From foreign and local women mission workers who were involved in creating spaces of their own, to local missionaries and evangelists who contested the institutional racism in mission institutions, to teachers and translators who read their own meanings into the ideas and words that Euro-American missionaries articulated, to several others who attached themselves to mission institutions and comprised a sizable section of the mission personnel. We have a diversity of characters and processes and initiatives. Their actions and interventions often tended to deviate from the institutional expectations and agendas of the missionary establishment, sometimes leading to conflicts and censure, indifference and dejection. They never became part of the hagiographical histories as they were not considered important or mature enough within the missionary ranks. They also never became part of the nationalist and post-colonial history since they came to be easily written off as colonial and hence looked at with contempt and suspicion. Yet, they too were part of the making of what is generally referred to as modernity, especially in a region like Kerala. I would like to just conclude now. To sum up, what I have tried to do is to show that historical actors and processes situated within highly contentious and polarizing moments, such as the colonial context, tend to be easily imputed with predetermined characteristics and meanings. Missionaries and their work is one such instance that is more often assumed rather than interpreted, explained, and understood. Now, what I have tried to do in this lecture is also to break down what is assumed and taken for granted, and briefly illustrate the various complexities and nuances of what constitutes missionaries and their engagement in society. This has been primarily a plea for the historical method to problematize and historicize terms, categories, and processes that are generally taken for granted. In other words, this is also a plea to return to the archive. Many a times we hide, as I guide students, as I supervise students, and I listen to many research scholars, what I increasingly find is the laziness to actually go back to the archive, because the archive has multiplicity of voices. It's about how you make possible as history to emerge from those. I will end this talk here. I really would like to hear your feedback, your questions, your comments. Thank you once again for this opportunity to give this lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for your lecture. He has in fact tried to remind all of us that while writing history, one has to be cautious about the pre-assumptions and cultivate a habit to look into the internal contradictions within categories historically formed. He has also tried to remind us that missionary archives still remain an area of big possibilities ahead. Without further delay, we can now enter into the Q&A session. Please type your questions into the chat box. We already have a set of questions in the chat box. So can we start the Q&A session?
Sure.
Okay. So the first question is from Jayanti Chami. The question is, the contributions of the missionaries helped to reduce the tension of caste in the earlier period, but at the same time, it negatively resulted in the exploitation of people on the basis of caste. Is it correct?
I shouldn't say yes or no. I don't know what is correct. So that is whether it is correct is a wrong question to ask. Certainly, again, in reference to caste, an old book that one can go back to is Duncan Forrester's Caste and Christianity, because he really kind of shows the debates that existed among missionaries on caste, and then the recent work of Rupa Viswanathan also really brings that out. The various kinds of complexities, the way missionaries were looking at caste. And it's difficult to say that in the earlier period or in the later period, I think these debates continue to exist. And some were much more vocal about trying to understand caste. Some were more, and that's where, as I said earlier, there is those who are always have a welcoming attitude towards understanding Indian society and how caste operated, despite their limitations, despite their, the frameworks that they adopted. There were also missionaries who were indifferent to it. So we need to see these complexities within how missionaries engaged with caste, and whether they, it was not missionaries who, brought in caste. You shouldn't. They are trying to engage with a certain reality of caste, with all their limitations, and that's my answer. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Next, we have two questions from Jane C. John. Shall I read it together?
Yeah.
As you have mentioned, the incoherence inside missionary archives, how can we researchers approach these materials? If you can please share your own experience. And the second question is, how these rereadings of the missionaries help us look at the debates on religious and the secular.
Okay. I think to answer the first question, there is no ready-made way of approaching any of these materials. When I first went into the archives, I was a complete novice. I was just given a whole set of annual reports, and I would just go through them chronologically, trying to read about Travancore and what is happening in Travancore. And this is the same I did also within the Northeast context when I was looking at the Nagas. Of course, you have to have, I don't need to kind of repeat this has already been said many times by various scholars, the need to kind of have a critical way of reading these material. And that criticality is not something that you're born with or anything. That is a criticality that you need to cultivate while reading this material. But at the same time, we shouldn't be. One thing I've learned is also we cannot go with very straitjacket ideas of what we are going to look for. What we find, if we go with too much of a focus of what we are looking for, we sometimes miss out on a lot of things that may actually question our hypothesis or what we are going with. Yes, we need to have a guiding idea. When we go into the archive, we need to have a research question developed. But what the archive, we also need to be open-ended. We also need to be open to what the kind of voices that can emanate from the archives. It's a training in being able to listen to multiple voices, the way in which they are arguing, the way in which they are narrating something, and to be able to kind of open to that possibility and have a dialogue with that. Secondly, how these rereadings of missionaries help us look at the debates on religious and secular. I'll not enter into the debates of religious and secular, but why I find this kind of assumptions, there are these predetermined assumptions about missionaries, is also, again, there is the religious secular binary. As I said in the beginning, just as the colonial, anti-colonial binary, much of the discussion in the colonial context begin to become polarized on this, colonial, anti-colonial, secular, religious. And this again comes into the reading of how we look at missionaries. There is a much of the assumptions around missionaries. For example, if you look at the church and the entire ecclesiastical structure, they still would not in any way be kind of depart from the hagiographical narratives. Hagiographical narratives are necessary for their sustenance, their legitimacy, and they would not in any way, they are not even open to sometimes criticism of it. Meanwhile, if you go into the other kind of, there is the secular kind of outlook where you do not want to take religion very seriously, you kind of bracket it as something that is not, something to be looked at with some level of contempt or ridicule. And what ends up happening is that you do not then engage with the religious subject very seriously. And I think this is where, this kind of division that, binary that has come about and binary that come about at various levels, sometimes, makes it easier for us to make assumptions, rather than really be serious, have an openness towards engaging with the complexities of this. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. We have a question from Ansu Matthew, who is a research scholar in the department. Can we find any converging point between the concept of the kingdom of God as envisaged by the missionaries and the concept of a modern nation put forward by the state?
I don't know. I have not thought about this. So I'm so sorry that I will not be able to. I'm not in a position to answer that question. Yeah, I don't want to kind of say something completely out of oblivion, yeah. And
okay,
yeah.
Thank you. She, in fact, has another question. The Protestant and Catholic missionaries were actively involved in the modernization of Kerala. But why is it that Protestant sources are usually discussed more? Is there any reason behind this?
I don't know. I don't know why it is so. I am sure Catholic sources are also being consulted. Maybe, it's also, again, that's a blind spot for me again. I think also that, it could also be the control over much of the material, control over research is also much stronger. I think it's stronger in every church for that matter, but then maybe it is because given the kind of structure of the Catholic Church, it could be. I'm just inferring. I do not have a correct answer or a valid answer for this, but then this is just an inference. It could be one of the reasons. And I think, Protestant sources also primarily because, when we talk about 19th century, I think it's also had to do with the 19th century. 19th century, again, we see Protestant missionaries more obviously in many points of conflict, many points of tension, many points where one is reflecting on becoming modern, and I think that is where the Protestant. And again, I'm not saying that the Catholic missionaries may not have done that. It's an underexplored maybe. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, sir, thank you. We have another question. Ajay Joy, an MPhil scholar in the department. Missionary sources written beyond the interest of the colonial state can be found in archives, but they are rarely used in writing history of Kerala. At the same time, we see repeated emphasis of certain types of missionary sources or certain areas of their work, such as tribal and Dalit conversions. In your opinion, what is the reason for this?
I cannot give a very fixed answer to it. But then in the lecture that I just delivered, I mentioned about the historiographical kind of departures, and what has happened is that with the subaltern studies and the especially with its post-colonial kind of avatar, what has happened is also that the concentration became again, on the subaltern subject, the constitution. And it's a very important, the thrust of history from below is extremely important, and given the kind of way in which histories have been written. But the concentration has become more on that, and rightly so. I'm not saying whether that shift is very important, but that has happened. My concern is that has happened at the risk of taking missionaries very taking missionaries not complicating missionaries as a category. The missionary engagement is of various kinds, at various levels. And my own, for example, I'm very interested, for example, in many of the discussions that missionaries have with Syrian Christians and Nayars, especially during this moment of Dalit conversions. To understand the anxieties and fears of the Nayars and the Syrian Christians, in fact, there is so much there. And there is so much there which tells us about the elite sections. Of course, Robin Jeffrey has talked about it briefly, but then there is something more than that. And during this period of transition, late 19th century, early 20th century, where was this? How do the elite sections actually reconstitute themselves in the wake of these mass conversions? This is a point that requires and what was the kind of missionary engagement there? Yeah, certain types of missionaries, I think, that is why I'm saying I'm just pushing the boundaries and being very provocative in many ways of saying that, let us, the missionary archives is much more than just the annual reports or the letters or the journals. There is much that exists, may not be so much in India, but still I feel that there is possibilities of even the annual reports. Annual reports are often, I feel, let's say, I want to work on print, I will go and look at annual reports just for print. See, this kind of selective and very instrumental way of looking at the archives has to change, and be able to really enter that world of the missionaries and why they felt, the negotiations that happened there, that becomes useful, I feel, in writing even histories not of the missionaries, but also of other subjects.
Okay, sir, thank you. There's another question from Ajay. Did the notion of Protestant labor introduced by the missionary serve any colonial interest, or was it an attempt by the missionaries to dissolve the opposition from the caste Hindus?
I personally have not come with the coin, like I've not seen this term Protestant labor as such, but in the 1860s, I can say very confidently that with the tenancy reforms that happened, there is and this is something that I have worked on more in detail, which is that 1850s and 1860s. 1850s is a moment of anarchy being let loose, and even missionaries, a lot of the younger missionaries are actively involved in the abolition of slavery and working among slave castes. There's a lot of enthusiasm, and as I mentioned earlier, with the revolt of 1857 and with the indigo plantation, with James Long getting imprisoned, and CMS becomes extremely wary of this enthusiasm and tries to kind of control the younger missionaries. And we also see, and the debate between Joseph Pete and George Martin, it's not exactly a debate, because George Martin is more or less silenced by Joseph Pete and saying that these native priests and some of these young missionaries are raking up issues and disturbing order. And Martin on the other hand does not directly, because again there are these relationships between them which he will not directly confront Pete, but he at the same time he says that we have a special cross to take for the slave castes. It is they who understand the meaning of Christianity far more than the Syrian Christians. And Martin actually says this, it's an age which predates liberation theology and all, and he's actually saying that, the slave castes understand the meaning of Christianity far more than the Syrian Christians, and therefore they are the agents of change. Now, Pete, of course, completely disagrees with me. He says we do not have a special cross. And you see a kind of taming of many of the missionaries by the 1860s with the tenancy reform that happens, and also with the way, then, many of the missionaries begin to kind of also assuage the fear among the Nayars and the Syrian Christians, telling them that, don't worry, we are going to make loyal and honest servants out of these ex-slaves. Yes, so the making of a certain kind of Protestant labor who will be docile, who would be good servants, good workers. And there is a very interesting nitpick of, missionary catching hold of a slave caste, someone from the Pulaya caste who about whom this missionary says that, earlier he used to steal, but now he doesn't steal anymore. So therefore, and this is the way he, tells the Syrian Christian that, therefore he will be a good laborer. So have him as your laborer, because he will not steal. He will be loyal to you, So there is a new kind of docility that is, there is a new kind of constitution of discourse on labor that is happening with the 1860s. So yeah, so that it doesn't serve, I don't know whether it serves colonial interest, maybe in the context of plantations, yes. But it is in many ways to assuage the fears of caste Hindus and Syrian Christians. Yes.
Thank you, sir. We do have a specific question from George Robinson asking about the colonial interest. Can we alienate the colonial interest of missionaries while engaging with the locals?
Can you, where is that? Can you just show
Can
me?
we alienate the colonial interest of missionaries while engaging with the locals?
I would like to ask, what is the colonial interest of the missionaries? If George Robinson could explain to me what the colonial interests of missionaries are. I pose that question. I do not want to answer that question. I would rather pose that question back. What exactly, tell me in very empirical terms, what is the colonial interest of missionaries? Because I do not mean to be offensive in any way, but what I'm asking is, we need to really unpack, there were missionaries who were very much supportive of colonial rules. There were missionaries who were also imprisoned by the colonial rulers. Now, if you're talking in terms of culture, again, as I illustrated in the lecture, it's not very fixed. It's not very, there is no fixity to the kind of relation or the interests of the missionary. It keeps varying. There is a bit of fluidity to it. So, so that is why, and I'm saying this with all, because I've worked also on the Nagas in the Northeast. I've realized that, there, if you ask me, can we, about the colonial interest of the missionaries, there was very strong. The American Baptist missionaries was very supportive of the British. The British were not very happy with the American Baptist missionaries for various reasons, but they were. But the missionaries were very supportive, and they felt that this is providential. So, yeah. So, these things vary, I feel, from context to context. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. We have a question from Biju Matthew. Have you come across any difference or similarity between the approaches of Protestant and Catholic missionaries, say in Kerala?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I do not want to say something out of my ignorance. I have not really, because I have not really worked on Catholic missions. If you ask me in the context of Northeast, yes, I could actually say more. But on Kerala, my reading is very poor in terms of the Catholic missionaries. So I have no answer to that. Yeah, sorry about that.
There's actually a follow-up on that question. Many a times the Catholic missionaries claim a lineage to Europe. However, they never imbibed modern European values. At least it appears. To put it bluntly, how come they are so regressive?
I don't know if, I think that is a strategy that they adopted. And I think that is a strategy adopted on the basis of the fact that that would be, Indianizing, themselves, and Robert D. Nobili and I think Ines Supanov and all have written about this. How, though that kind of adopting the upper caste kind of attire and upper caste kind of sensibilities is the one way in which you can actually engage with that kind of audience, and because that was the targeted audience. Now, in the case of Protestants, you have to understand that many of the Protestant missionaries were coming from an abolitionist background. There is already so much of turmoil in Europe at this time and in the US. So many of them come with, as I say, blunt, as you have put it bluntly, they come from very progressive circumstances where, there's a constant questioning happening. So when, and when they come to the Indian context, they are far more intolerant of various practices like caste and labor practices, but, they read their limited understanding of the limitations of what the abolitionist movement in Britain is read also into, that somehow gets extended to how they engage here in India also. Yeah.
Yes, sir. There's one more follow-up to that question. Finally, are there differences between Eastern and Western missionaries, say in Kerala?
Do you mean Eastern in terms of the Syrian Orthodox and in what respect do you say Eastern? Is it in terms of the Eastern Church, or is it in terms of West-East kind of the?
We don't have a follow-up on that, sir.
Oh, okay, yeah.
We can skip the question if.
Yeah, fine. We'll come back to it if there is a follow-up.
Okay. If there's a follow-up, we will.
Yes, there is. Jalina, Biju has just typed in Eastern Church.
Eastern Church, yeah. Sorry,
okay, sir. Eastern Church, yeah. I'm sorry, Biju. I don't know answers to many of your questions. Again, Eastern Church, the way, now there is again, this is not something that we have really explored, especially in the context of the Eastern church in Kerala, because as we have looked at, as many of the studies on Syrian Christianity actually shows, it was far more of a caste identity rather than a denominational identity. It had a denominational side to it, but, it was largely a caste identity, or a social identity. And that caste, because of which it was not really able to, it really did not think about opening up or wanting, conversion was not on its agenda actually. And this is something that Protestant missionaries constantly come into a conflict with the Syrian church and the Syrian Christians in the early phase of their mission of help. That, they are unable to kind of convince the Syrian Christians the importance of, of missionary work and of attracting people to Christianity. But on the other hand, Eastern Church, traditionally has, traditionally it has had a certain, and that I do not know much about, sorry for my ignorance, but traditionally Eastern Church has had missionary movements. But in the specific case of Kerala, you see the Eastern Church actually kind of, and that is, and one of the arguments put forward by the CMS while engaging with the Eastern Church is that, you have lost touch with your own roots. You have lost touch with your own roots, and therefore we are here to help you reclaim your root. And one of the aspects of that root is this: be doing missionary work. Yeah. So yeah, that I will stop that.
Thank you, sir. We have another question from Nivedita K. Do you think that many of the issues which appeared as central to the missionary discourses of reform reappeared as seminal to the debates of the national question?
Okay, let me just think about that question once. Do you think that many of the issues which appeared as central to missionary discourses of reform reappeared as seminal? I do not think so. I do not. Maybe in the early kind of phase of, I see a lot of, because I'm also working a bit on the early ecumenical movement in the early 20th century. There you see a lot of overlaps between Gandhian nationalism and a lot of what the missionaries are trying to, and there's a lot of dialogue and exchanges that are happening at that particular moment. But whether that is carried through, that these are not, these do not become actually concrete realities, or these are not issues that are carried through. But even in the previous phase, that's whether and if you're thinking of specific nationality question, like in the case of, for example, in the Northeast, there is a lot of overlap with missionary discourse and the nationality question there. And here I'm talking more in terms of nationality question in Northeast. So Naga nationalism and Christianity overlap at various levels. But when we talk about the Indian context, not so much, except for what I mentioned as in the early 20th century, some level of intellectual exchanges happening. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. We do not have any more questions in the chat box. Wait, there's one which has just come up. Dr. Neeta, she's asking, did you come across work of Salvation Army in Kerala?
No, I have not. I have not really studied that, or I have not looked at that.
Okay, so I guess there are no more questions. I now invite Ansu Matthew, a PhD scholar in the department, to propose the vote of thanks. Ansu?
Thank you, Jelena, and good evening to all. For past 1 hour, we have been enriched and enlightened by the knowledge and experience of Dr. John Thomas, Assistant Professor of History at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Guwahati. His are focused on multiple fissures among missionaries and essentiality to go beyond a selective and instrumentalist reading of missionary archives, and also the need for relooking and rereading missionary archives. Sir, your lecture will generate fresh ideas and insights in all of us. We understand that you have taken time out of your very important schedule to contribute this webinar. On behalf of the Department of History, Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit, Kaladi, I extend my sincere gratitude to you, sir. I also like to thank all the participants, without whose participation and involvement, no such session is complete. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. John Thomas. That was a very inspiring and enriching session. Very, very nice.